All right, welcome to another episode of the Migraine Miracle Moment. Today I'm going to focus on the most important topic in migraine that you've probably never heard of. So in the last episode, I talked about the body of evidence indicating that mitochondrial dysfunction plays a key role in migraines. And along with that, the energy crisis model of migraine that illustrates that role. And there I talked about how mitochondrial function helps to explain why some people are more prone to migraines than others, why the same set of environmental factors can trigger a migraine in one brain and not another. And that brings up a topic that gets almost no attention, especially in comparison to the attention that migraine triggers get. And yet, in my opinion, is much more important than triggers because understanding it provides a path to lasting transformation. And that concept is our internal susceptibility to migraine, which is driven by three primary factors. And understanding those factors and how we can influence them in our favor, because they are all things we can influence, is what offers us the path to true and lasting freedom. It's where we have the largest amount of control over our future and where we can fundamentally alter the course of our lives with migraine. So first, I want to introduce this concept of internal susceptibility and explain why understanding the factors that impact it are far more important than understanding the factors that trigger a single migraine attack. Because it's what determines whether or not a particular trigger or combination of triggers will actually provoke an attack. So to help you understand or appreciate how this works, here's an analogy. Imagine a medieval castle that's surrounded by walls on all sides. And of course, the purpose of those walls is to keep invaders from storming the castle. Now, there are two main factors that are going to determine whether those walls are going to hold up in the face of an invading army. One of those factors is the strength of the weaponry that the invaders are using to try to destroy those walls. So are they just using their bare hands? Are they firing arrows, throwing rocks, using battering rams, hurling stones with catapults, or launching cannonballs? Some of these are obviously going to work much better, have a much better chance at breaking down those walls than others. But then the other factor determining their success in breaking down the walls are the strength of the walls themselves. If the walls are made of cardboard or are just decayed and broken down, then maybe an invading army can bring them down with just their bare hands. On the other hand, if they are made of reinforced concrete or titanium alloy, then maybe even a cannonball isn't going to bring them down. So in this analogy, all of the various implements or weaponry that an invading army would use to break down the castle walls are the migraine triggers. And your internal susceptibility to a migraine are the strength of the castle walls. So whether or not a particular trigger actually provokes a migraine depends on two things. Number one, the strength of the weapons the invaders are using to try to break down the castle walls. But number two, the strength of the walls themselves. Now, what would happen if you strengthen your walls to the point where no existing weaponry would break them down? What would happen is that no invaders would ever get into your castle, right? So one critical point that this analogy illustrates is that the factors that trigger migraines are an entirely different set of things than the factors that impact our susceptibility to those triggers. So back to our analogy, the factors that make for strong weaponry are entirely different than the factors that make for strong walls. And your internal susceptibility, the reason why you get a migraine in the face of a particular set of triggers and someone else doesn't, is because of the strength of your walls. it's because of your internal susceptibility. And I'll explain why it's so important to make this distinction in a minute. So first, what are the physiologic factors that determine the strength of our walls, so to speak? Well, there are a great many things that matter, a great many things that contribute to our internal susceptibility. But they all coalesce around three main physiological factors. The first, and potentially most significant, is mitochondrial function, which I talked about and introduced in the last episode. So mitochondrial function refers to the ability of your mitochondria to generate energy. The second is chronic neuroinflammation, which, as it sounds, is a chronic state of inflammation in brain tissue. And in migraine, this includes chronic inflammation in the pain-sensing areas of the brainstem, in the meninges or the coverings of the brain, and in the hypothalamus. And then the third factor is central sensitization, which is when brain cells, in particular those in pain pathways, become highly sensitive or hyperexcitable to stimuli. So these are the three main physiologic factors that drive internal susceptibility, or the strength of your castle walls in the analogy. And there are many, many different processes that influence these three things. But these are the ones that contribute most directly to internal susceptibility. Also, these three factors interact with each other. So neuroinflammation increases central sensitization and worsens mitochondrial function, for example. All three are also largely driven by diet, lifestyle, and environment. And so they are hugely modifiable. By the way, they are also significant factors in a whole host of neurological conditions that impact the brain, from strokes to Alzheimer's to Parkinson's. So addressing them not only impacts your vulnerability to migraine, but also influences your risk of all of those conditions. So why does this matter for you? One, because all of the factors that contribute to the strength of your walls or your internal susceptibility is usually not part of the migraine conversation. Definitely not addressed at all in standard migraine care inside of a medical clinic, and so is a huge missed opportunity. Plus, it's the area where we can make the biggest and most lasting impact. And two, because a lack of awareness of the importance of the strength of your walls and the factors that affect it can cause you to unknowingly do things that weaken them and that make things much worse over the long term. So consider the case of abortive medications like triptans or other prescription migraine treatments. Well, how do they help? They help by temporarily kicking the invaders out of the castle, right? At least, in the beginning when we first start taking them and they're working. But by also worsening mitochondrial function, increasing central sensitization, and neuroinflammation, they also weaken our castle walls. So in the short term, they can help get the invaders out. But by weakening our walls, they make us much more susceptible to another attack. So whereas initially it might have taken dynamite or cannonballs to break down the walls, now they can get in with their bare hands. And it's all too easy to end up in this vicious cycle that happens to so many people, where weaker walls lead to more attacks, which leads to more medications, which leads to weaker walls, which leads to more attacks, and so on forever. And ultimately, this cycle obliterates your walls altogether so that you can no longer protect the castle at all. So in other words, mitochondrial dysfunction, neuroinflammation, and central sensitization become so severe that you're basically under constant siege, which we know as chronic migraine. Or consider another case, the case of exercise or physical activity. So this can sometimes provoke a migraine, right? And that's because of its short-term effects on things like energy consumption, inflammation, and gut permeability. Yet, exercise is probably the single best thing you can do to boost mitochondrial function, which again will strengthen your castle walls. So just like with abortive medications, it's all too easy to end up in a vicious cycle. and is kind of the opposite scenario of abortives. In this case, if we're primarily thinking about the short term, we might avoid physical activity so that we're less likely to provoke an attack. But avoiding it weakens our walls, making us more vulnerable to attacks of all kinds, including exercise, so we end up having more, which makes us want to avoid physical activity even more, which weakens our walls even further, and so on and so on. So when you understand the relevance of both of these things, then you realize that avoiding exercise is not the solution. Rather, the solution is to figure out a program that allows you to reap the benefits for improving mitochondrial function without provoking an attack. And of course, then you can flip a vicious cycle into a virtuous one, where exercise strengthens your walls, making you less vulnerable to the short-term effects of exercise, allowing you to do more, which strengthens your walls even more, and so on and so on. As you can see with just these two examples, understanding this concept of internal susceptibility and its difference from triggers not only helps you to understand things that would have otherwise seemed nonsensical, but it allows you to be so much more strategic in your overall approach, including not ending up in these vicious cycles that are so common and lead to so much avoidable suffering. And that makes all of the difference in the world. It literally can make the difference between daily migraines, where your castle walls are totally obliterated, to migraine freedom, where the walls are so strong that nothing can break them down. It also matters because the factors that impact mitochondrial function, central sensitization, and neuroinflammation encompass far more than just diet. And oftentimes you can make the greatest impact by addressing non-dietary factors because they have such an impact and because they're often overlooked. Another way to think about the difference here is that things that we do to reduce triggers or relieve an attack are part of a short-term solution or strategy. They're an effort to prevent our walls from being knocked down, or what we do when they do get knocked down. On the other hand, things we do to strengthen the walls are part of a long-term solution. And building strong and resilient castle walls is not something that happens overnight. It takes time. But that's exactly why it is so much more powerful than any kind of short-term measure. When you put time and energy into a short-term solution, it doesn't last, it doesn't add up. But when you put time and energy into a long-term solution, it does, it accumulates. The more you do, the more you gain. So the more time, energy, and resources you put into strengthening those walls, the stronger and stronger they become. And every action you take to strengthen them is an investment in your future. And the thing that's missing from virtually everyone who is struggling with migraines is a long-term strategy or a strategy for strengthening the walls, because it just hasn't been part of the conversation. My entire work for well over a decade now has been about researching what factors impact our internal susceptibility and how to address them to achieve long-term protection and migraine freedom. And in future episodes, I'll be talking more about these three factors that drive internal susceptibility: mitochondrial function, central sensitization, and neuroinflammation, and the various ways that we can influence them to build our fortress of protection and reduce our internal susceptibility. But I wanted to first lay out this framework because, number one, I'll be referencing back to it, and number two, because hopefully it highlights this crucial distinction and why understanding these factors matters so much. Also, I recently created a visual model of these three driving forces, along with all of the various factors that influence them and how they're interrelated. And I'll be putting that model up on the Substack post that accompanies this episode. So if you're not already subscribed to the Substack newsletter, you can click the link in the podcast description to do so. Lastly, I encourage you to start thinking about this concept of strengthening your castle walls and how it might change the way you think about the role of diet and lifestyle when it comes to migraines, and how it's a more empowering way of thinking of those things. In the next episode, I'll be digging deeper into mitochondrial function and all of the various ways in which it is under our control. So if you aren't already subscribed to the podcast, be sure to do so you don't miss that episode. Thank you so much for listening. And now it's time to go out there and slay the beast.